Back, everybody, at least to my visual world. And I'd like to begin by bowing to you. And you do what you like, but I'm going to bow to you. So our topic for tonight is the second of the three marks of existence, or three ways of viewing our lives. And this is dukkha in Sanskrit. And we translate it normally into English as suffering. There's been, through the years, some controversy about that translation. I was recently looking at a video of Dzongtso Rinpoche talking about something, and he was very exercised about what a terrible translation that was, although I don't think he offered a better one. So suffering, I think, it means what we think it means. It's not that complicated, but it also is translated, perhaps, if you pair it with its opposite, the other word that's used in conjunction with dukkha is sukha, and sukha means like ease. And Sukhavati, for example, is a place of great ease. And so you could think of dukkha as being a state of lack of ease, some kind of anxiety, or dissatisfaction is another way to maybe make it more real in daily life. A subtle quality of anxiety is another translation. Misery is another translation that one reads. So I think you get the idea, like which part of the emotional range this is describing. And the thing about the teaching here is that the point is that you're supposed to sort of see that this is an integral part, an unerasable part, kind of the part you can't take away of our every moment of our lives, that this is who we are, that it's really part and parcel of being human. It's kind of the cost of the ticket for taking a ride on this planet as a human being, is that you're going to experience this dukkha. And, it's not exactly conditional. It's not presented as conditional. And this is a big difference between the non-theistic traditions that we belong to and the theistic tradition, which does often promise a salvation or some kind of final relief, you could say. We talk about various kinds of relief in Buddhism, various kinds of transcendence, or various ways of working with suffering. But I don't think I've really read any teaching that talks about erasing it or making it go away. So I'll come back to that point. But part of the idea of this teaching is that you should, get used to the idea that it's just here. It's just like impermanence. It's just how it is. And I was thinking of an example of this the other night. I was, as maybe some of you might do, I was visiting the site Netflix, and it was offering me a variety of things to look at, movies and television shows and series and documentaries. And they were organized, by categories, things I might like based on things I had liked in the past, and award-winning dark dramas or international shows, or, So they had them in these kind of stripes going across my screen, all these different things I could look at. And it didn't seem to matter to, whether I was looking at something about rich people or something about poor people, something about old people or something about young, something about a documentary, a true story, or a complete fantasy. The driver of the movie or the show was some quality of dissatisfaction, right? That's there in every kind of piece of entertainment, at least in the theater or film realm. You have to have some kind of conflict, and it's sort of what drives our interest. I suppose you could have a show where like everything was fine and nothing happened. That's supposed to be what the God realm is like, according to Buddhism. If you practice certain kinds of samadhi, certain kinds of absorptions, you can end up reborn in the God realm where there are like no problems and you have no desires. And if you do get slightly hungry or thirsty, you have amrita, but basically nothing's happening and you're just in a state of satisfaction. And that's nice, but it's not considered really very helpful for your path to enlightenment, because you're not also motivated to try and practice. So you just kind of groove. I didn't see many shows like that. We tend to be more interested in when there's a conflict and dissatisfaction and suffering and what that entails and how that came to be. This is, as the other marks are, really one of the foundational teachings. You find the presentation on the 3 marks in the Dhammapada. You find it in the earliest Theravada scriptures. And I'm afraid it's probably where Buddhism, at least when I began, it had a reputation of being sort of a downer religion, right? And you're just talking about suffering and who wants to hear about that? And particularly this teaching it's pretty uncompromising. But I think it would be important to, because it comes from this Indian background, to look at what they meant or what was meant by suffering. So because it is such a core teaching, there's been a lot of commentary on it and a lot of definition. And so there, one way of talking about it is that we start with what's called inherited suffering. That's what I meant by the price of the ticket. That just comes with being a human. And this is defined as birth, old age, sickness, and death. So these are 4 aspects of suffering that come along with just being human. There are interesting commentaries about the psychological aspects of those things. I think the teachings literally mean that birth is painful, both for the mother and for the infant, that getting old is no fun, being sick is no fun, and dying doesn't look like much fun. So those things are considered just inherited suffering. They're part of our lives, but there are also psychological aspects of them Birth, for example, means being sort of pushed out of some situation that might be comfortable into another situation which feels, at least initially, less comfortable, unfamiliar. We have this experience very regularly. Old age, the psychological experiences of being less capable today than we thought we were yesterday, or less able, less sharp, less there, some diminishment. Sickness, of course, means, you're limited. You can't do everything you wanted to do. You can't even go out of the house right now. Or maybe now you can, but a couple of weeks ago you couldn't. And if you were that there's a definite limit, an end, you're running out of time and it's going to stop. And so that's no fun psychologically, to be thinking about that or feeling that. So those are the inherited sufferings. Another class of suffering is, I don't know why these make me smile. They're not funny, but I don't know. The first one is to sort of, it's like to get or to be presented with what you don't want, to get what you don't want. And the second one is to not get what you do want. And then the third one is, once you do get what you want, that you worry that you're not going to be able to hold it, that it's going to fall away, it's going to slip away. I sometimes think of like a train ride, or if you're on the tube or you have a seat and you're sitting there and it's like, it's okay for a little while. And then comes somebody when they sit down next to you. It's like, you get what you don't want. Maybe you didn't want that person to sit next to you. If it's a flight and you're in the middle seat and you're surrounded by people you're not happy about, that's an example of that kind of suffering. And so these are, they don't need much explanation from me. I think, I'm sure you're quite creative and able to come up with examples of these things in your life. It is a little harder sometimes when we're happy, when we have what we want, to believe the truth of suffering, because, hey, it's great, it's all fine. But because we've lived for a while and have some experience, there is an anxiety, even in our happiest moments, about that this isn't going to last, that how can we keep this? How can we hang on to this? And to the degree that we exert energy in trying to hold on to something, a particular state, very frequently a particular person or a relationship, even a particular sense, kind of an emotion. Maybe you worked for something really hard and suddenly you get it and someone praises you for it. And then it's over. And there you are again. The American novelist Philip Roth won every single prize there was in the literary world, at least in the US. And he was asked about this at one point, and he won several of them more than one time. And he said, it's nice. It's nice that night. But the next morning, I'm at my desk and there's a blank piece of paper in front of me. So even the nicest feelings are slippery. And this creates in us a sense of anxiety or unease or dissatisfaction. The last classical kind of suffering, it's broken into 8. So we had the 4 inherited, and then these 3, and then there's one that's just called the suffering of it's general suffering, and it's based on impermanence. It's based on this awareness that we have almost at a ground level, that everything is shifting around, and there's no stability. There's no solidity. And as I say, often we can ignore that, or we are not, it's not in the front of our mind, but it's there, and it creating a sense of, nervousness or anxiety. So the point of this meditation, or the point of this teaching, is to try to tune into that, to tune into these things in our life, to actually begin to see, oh yeah, that is the case. I am frequently being driven, or my activity comes from some quality of uneasiness, some quality of unsettledness, dissatisfaction. But there's more to it. Of the 3 marks, suffering is a little bit different, it seems to me, in that, the first one, impermanence, we might try to make things permanent. I mean, we do. We try to, we buy insurance, or we try to build really strong structures, or we try to hold on, try to make things permanent. Or the last one, selflessness or egolessness. We try to believe in our ego, in ourself, and we try to take care of it and keep it out of trouble, pamper it to the degree possible. But there isn't really any sort of textual support for that. There's no sutra that says make things permanent, or organize your life so that your ego is strong. Those 2 marks are not, they're not, it's not promoted that you should try to solve those conditions. They're just presented as the facts. Whereas suffering, or dukkha, is presented as something that you maybe could do something about. And certainly, it is our wish to do something about it. When we're suffering, we don't like it, and we want to change it. So in the list of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, suffering is presented as just kind of one of the facts. But in the Four Noble Truths, which is another of these foundational teachings, suffering is presented as the fact, the first fact of our life, but there is a second and a third and a fourth truth. And they relate to suffering by saying there's an origin of it, and it is possible to work with it, or even the teaching says cessation, although I've never really read a teacher who said you could make it stop. They talk about you can transcend it, or you can experience your life in a way where it's not a big deal, it doesn't bother you. So there is an invitation to look into suffering a little more and ask, okay, where does it come from? What is the antidote? What are the techniques? How does one work with it? And what happens if I do? Because we know what happens if you don't. You just continue suffering. we have come to the point, somehow or another, that we're interested in what happens if we try to do something. That's probably why you started a practice at some point or another. So the idea is that the origin of suffering, if you look into it, where does it come from? There are, different explanations, but ultimately it goes back to this quality of ignorance. Ignorance about our life, that we ignore the basic facts, that we ignore impermanence, that we ignore egolessness. We try to believe in an ego. We try to hold on permanently. And these create suffering. This is, roughly speaking, of course, the explanations are much more detailed than this, but for this evening, the idea is that the root cause of suffering is some kind of ignorance, or Trungpa Rinpoche calls it sometimes absent-mindedness, that you're not willing to be in the present moment with your life. You really rather hold on to something that isn't really happening. A concept, a dualistic judgment. We'd rather hold on to that because it's familiar than to stay really present here and experience awareness. And that is the main antidote. So according to the teachings, the source is ignorance and the main antidote is awareness. And this is developed through mindfulness practices in life, and of course through shamatha vipassana practice in sitting. So that's, roughly speaking, what you can do about suffering, is that you can look into it, you can analyze it, which is already pretty good. Like, most people don't even notice. But if you're looking into it and you're analyzing and you're trying to understand and thinking about antidotes and even trying them on, that's considered, very far along. You're well ahead of the game at that point. You're not just in the clutches of suffering anymore. You are actually you're transcending it. It's said that if you're really practicing awareness, if you're really trying to understand how human life works, if you really see into it, then you're not suffering in the same way. You can't make birth, old age, sickness, and death go away. You can't make that person not sit down next to you on the train. But you can not make a big deal about it. You cannot suffer because of it. You cannot make it worse. There's a story I wanted to tell you from the Zen tradition. Let me see if I have time. This is a short story about Suzuki Roshi, this teacher that I began studying with, and it's about something he said in the middle of a long meditation retreat on the third or fourth day of a 7-day retreat, in the last period of the evening. And these retreats are strenuous. You start at 3 or 4 in the morning and you meditate really all day, basically, with alternations. But it's demanding, and you're in pain physically and mentally and emotionally. It's like, oh my God, what did I get into? And on like the 3rd or 4th night, he is supposed to have said, I wasn't at this talk, but I was at I heard it from a person who was there, and Suzuki Roshi began the last period of the evening, so about 9 o'clock, by saying, in in the middle of meditation, he started talking to the students and he said, the suffering you are now feeling. And so everybody's sitting there and they're, you know, looking at the wall and they're hearing these words come out of, you know, dark space slowly. And so they're starting to provide the next thing they expect him to say. And he spoke slowly and haltingly. English wasn't his mother tongue. The suffering you are now feeling, you will feel. So everybody's thinking, you know, until I, and he said, for the rest of your life. And they're like, oh no. But of course, it's the middle of the last period of meditation. You don't move in a Zen meditation retreat. You know, they're just staring at the wall. Nobody says anything. And they have another half hour to kind of take in and chew on what he was saying, what he meant. And he was, I think, you know, and the way this was presented was like, don't think that by practicing meditation and being a good boy or a good girl, you're going to stop your legs from aching if you sit a long time, or you're going to banish boredom, or you're going to stop your desire to be somewhere else. That's not going to stop. You're always going to be confronted with that. But here you are, meditating in a Zen monastery with friends and an enlightened Zen teacher. How bad can it be? You know, that they had time to think about that. So, you know, we do try. I mean, I was thinking today, I did this to my daughter, and I think most parents do. Like when she hurt herself as a little kid, I would pick her up and say, oh, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. It's all right. It's all going to be fine, you know. Don't worry. Mama's here, Papa's here. There's no, you know, trying to create. I mean, and there was no way not to do this, but trying to create this sort of heaven world where everything's going to be all right. And I certainly have that somewhere in me, that my parents must have done that for me, because I think, geez, if I can just kind of jiggle reality a little bit more, I can get to this place where it's going to be all right. But this teaching is saying, don't go there. Don't try that. It's a waste of time. Rather, kind of tune into how it actually is and be okay with that. So that's sort of the message. Blah, blah, blah. I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. This is a big topic, and Buddhism has a lot to say about it. But why don't we break into groups and have you say things about it to one another?